Welcome back. This is History 1122, second half of Western Civ. We're going to talk about another consequence of the Columbian Exchange here. In our last lecture, we talked about Atlantic slavery. Here, we're going to talk about European imperialism or colonization. The title of this lecture is The Middle Ground, or Close Encounters of the Colonial Kind. Context here, European imperialism, European colonization of the New World. Another context, the initial encounter between Europeans and the indigenous people of the Western world. Significance, this lecture on the middle ground gives us a glimpse into that initial collision between these two very different societies. Let me mention a couple of specific contexts. We got the big context, European imperialism or colonization. More specific context is New France. That's what we're going to be looking at. The Jesuits in New France and the French fur traders living and trading, living among the Huronian Indians there. Let's characterize the middle ground. The middle ground is a phrase, an idea. I believe it's created by historian Richard White in his book by the same name, where he explores the clash of the French and Indian civilizations. The middle ground, it represents a search for compromise and accommodation between the Europeans and the Indians. The middle ground is necessary because neither side can simply impose its will on the other. And if you can't impose your will, then you have to talk. You have to compromise. You have to put yourself in the other guy's shoes, and you have to begin to accommodate the other side's point of view. And not only is it simply a matter of not being able to impose your will, but both sides, both the French and the Indians, believe that they can take advantage of the other side, or they can make use of the other side for trading purposes or what have you. So the middle ground represents the inability of either side to gain their goals simply through force. It represents, again, the attempt to understand the reasoning of the other, French or the Indians. The middle ground is a place, psychologically at least, of constant improvisation and invention, as both sides try to figure out how to make this relationship profitable. Keep in mind that the middle ground takes place at the very far edge, the very periphery of French imperial power. And of course, as you reach the periphery of the empire's power, that's where the power is at its weakest. So you have to be able to improvise, compromise, and accommodate. The middle ground allows us to examine Indian agency. It's not just the Europeans imposing their will on the Indians. You'll see this is very much a 50-50 thing here as these two societies collide. The Indians aren't simply acted upon. They themselves act and force the French to respond. So the middle ground is kind of an example of what we call cultural history, or even a history of mentalities, sort of an intellectual history in the sense that we're getting inside the mindset of two distinctly different groups as they grapple with each other. Cultural history is relatively new. It's emerged over the last couple of generations. It's essentially the search for meaning among the most subtle acts, among objects, among artifacts, a search for a meaning in the context of these times. This is different from traditional Whig history. Let me characterize it a bit. Whig history is the notion that all history has been preparing for and is aimed at the present state of things. In other words, where we are today is both natural and inevitable. And of course, that's nonsense. History is contingent upon many acts, many decisions, even acts of nature. Whig history is written to justify present practices. Whig historians make assumptions about the direction of history. For example, U.S. history is one of inevitable progress and expansion of freedom. This, of course, goes back to the ideas of American exceptionalism This notion of American freedom, of course, is a starting point when we talk about American exceptionalism. You can think about recent U.S. history. The U.S. invasion of Iraq, for many of us, is just a mere expansion of American freedom into a very odd and alien place, into Arabic and Muslim cultures. U.S. expansion into Vietnam was sold to the American people as the expansion of freedom. The United States efforts in World War II were quite often sold as an attempt to bring these German and Japanese societies out of this sort of fascist degradation into the freedom sponsored by the Americans. So Whig history has a sort of inevitability about it. Cultural history does not. Cultural history tends to let the people and the artifacts speak for themselves. Whig history makes the present seem inevitable, discounts contingency. Whig history follows history backwards and finds road markers along the way pointing to the inevitable. Cultural history follows history forward, looking for meaning and agency along the way. So there's two quite different ways of going about historical scholarship. Earlier histories, Bancroft and other early American historians had discussed New France and the Indians there as being incidental to the story of European progress, European expansion. Indian demise is presented as inevitable. Indian agency is diminished. The Indians are imposed upon as opposed to being actors of agency, of power, of forcing the Europeans to respond. Now, I want to talk about strengths and weaknesses of the two sides of the Jesuits here in New France and the Huronians. Let's start with the French weaknesses. The reason we know this story of the middle ground is because the Jesuit priest in New France kept detailed records. I think they're called the Jesuit records, these archives. And so we draw on that information to build this type of lecture. French weaknesses, and I'm going to talk specifically here about the Jesuits. They wore long black robes, which is a very inappropriate dress for this rough country in which they're living, constantly sort of stumbling and getting caught up in the brush, making themselves look ridiculous and comical to the Indians. The Jesuits, like most European men, had beards. The Indians view this as repulsive. You'll notice the Indians do not have beards. The Indians view these beards as nothing but more than a flycatcher or a food trap, and they don't understand it, and it gives them a poor first impression of the Europeans. Of course, the Jesuits are celibate. Jesuits take a vow of celibacy, a vow of poverty, vows of obedience, so that their lives are directed entirely towards the worship of God and a rejection of the material or secular world. I don't suppose this would be terribly noteworthy, except for the fact that the Jesuits, and this is one of their weaknesses, the Jesuits are sort of constantly admonishing the Indians for their sex lives. Indian women, as they mature, are encouraged to experiment sexually with multiple partners. Now, once married, they're expected to be faithful to their husbands. To the Jesuit priest, of course, these Indian women appear to be committing sin, promiscuity. Their sexual traditions do not fit into the European categories. So the Jesuits are admonishing the Indians for their sex lives, and the Indians, you can imagine how tiresome this gets, where people stick their nose where it doesn't belong. I think the Indians look at the Jesuits and say, hey, look, you don't even play the game, so why are you trying to make up the rules? What else? Weaknesses. Well, the Indians have sort of an ambivalent view of this new Christian God. If he's killing off the Indians, then he's a source of awe and terror. At the same time, The Jesuit priests appear to have a direct connection to this God with their dress, their Latin, their holy water, their crucifixes, the Mass. So there's a combination here of strength and weaknesses where you're both in awe of this new powerful God and his representatives on earth, and at the same time disgusted with this God for laying waste to your society. So these are some of the Jesuit weaknesses. They have strengths as well. Simple courage. The Jesuit priests are venturing off with the Indians into this wilderness with a people whose language they barely share, whose traditions they do not share. This takes a lot of guts, and the Indians recognize this. Jesuits are very devout and well-educated and highly motivated men. Jesuit strengths, they're not interested in Indian possessions. They're not interested in Indian women, unlike, say, the French fur traders. And they're immune to the diseases that are killing the Indians. The Jesuits obviously have some connection with this powerful Christian God. The Jesuits have access to technology that the Indians want. The Jesuits, of course, are literate, and this gives them an advantage over the Indians. Now, strengths and weaknesses of the Indians. Well, the Huronians have a home court advantage. They are playing in their territory. They know how to hunt, fish, and survive in this wilderness. The Indians have great self-confidence in their society. They believe it to be superior to European society. The Indians are polytheistic. That is, they can simply take this new Christian God and include him in their already existing pantheon of gods. Of course, the Jesuits don't appreciate this, so you see the two different points of view here. The Indians are very good at turning Europeans into Indians. We have a lot of evidence for this, where Europeans are either kidnapped and then grow up among the Indians and stay, or they simply leave European settlement and go join the Indians. Another advantage that the Indians have, in these northern latitudes, you have a brief summer, and a billion black flies and mosquitoes emerge from the lakes and the bogs, and they can eat you alive. The Indians smear animal fat all over their bodies to form a protective sheen. And of course, the Europeans regard this as disgusting and suffer these bites. Disadvantages, obvious. They have no immunity. The Indians have no immunity to European diseases. They become dependent upon European trade goods, and they're a culture of, they're an oral culture. They are not literate. So these are a few of the disadvantages the Indians suffer. We're going to do one more segment on the middle ground. We'll do that in our next lecture. Thank you.